Hi again guys, and welcome to another installment of Rivals on Gran Turismo 6, and this time we have actually a suggested three-way battle between Italian front-engined GT cars from Alfa Romeo, Maserati and Ferrari. Now of course there are other GT class exotics from Italy, but these three are very close rivals. They're very similar in many ways, and so which one turns out to be the winner could be kind of hard to predict. So, as always, I have put extra information about these cars in the description below, such as tunes and more in-depth reviews, but for now, let's get straight into it and first of all break down each individual car, how it drives, how it performs and what it's like in general, and then, as always of course, put them head to head in an on-paper battle. First up we have the Maserati Gran Turismo. This is a vehicle which, at least partially, is what the Alfa Romeo 8C is based on. It shares the same engine, although for some reason, and it really doesn't seem fair, the Maserati is actually allowed to be tuned to a higher level on both power and torque than the Alfa Romeo is. And that's a shame, because the Alfa Romeo has the potential to actually be even quicker than this car were it allowed to be tuned to that same level. Now this Maserati can do roughly 240 miles per hour flat out. That's the same kind of speed that the Alfa Romeo 8C can do, but with less power and torque. So if the Alfa Romeo could be tuned to the same level as this, there's a very strong chance that it could be a quicker car. Now as far as price, strangely enough the Maserati is actually cheaper than the Alfa Romeo at a still pretty hefty 166 grand. And overall, this is definitely my personal favourite car of the three. Maserati is one of my favourite brands, if not my favourite automotive brand, and I love literally every car they've ever made. This is the only Maserati that we currently have featured on the game, and so we have to make do with what we've got. As it happens though, although this car isn't really the kind of vehicle that will worry full-on supercars, it certainly has its uses. The handling is much better than you'd expect from more of a luxury GT exotic with a heavier curb weight, and overall it is the cheapest of the three, which, considering it's a Maserati, is pretty impressive. What though about the car that at least it partially shares mechanicals with? The Alfa Romeo 8C. Well, the 8C is considered by many people to be one of the best looking cars ever made, certainly one of the best looking modern cars available, and I would agree with that. I'm not a huge Alfa Romeo fan in general, but there are certain models that they've made which I do think are really nice cars, and a lot of the cars that they've made that I do like are featured on the game. This is one of them. Now personally I think the open-top version of all three of these cars is the best version. Of course the Ferrari California is only available as an open top, but I do personally prefer the Alfa Romeo 8C Spider and the Maserati Gran Cabrio instead of the coupe. On a game though, you don't really need the rag top option. It doesn't add anything to the performance, it's just more about real life enjoyment. Now this car has a pretty hefty price of 220 grand, and we already touched on the fact that it doesn't have the power and torque that it should have, given that it is so similar to the Gran Turismo. That being said, it's not without its advantages. In particular, the weight on the Alfa Romeo is lower than the Maserati by around 50 or so kilos, which isn't a huge amount, but it's still notable nonetheless. In a straight line, we already covered the fact that it is very similar to the Maserati, and around the track, they do break very even as well, and as you'll have noticed of course at the bottom of the video, I'm now including the individual lap times in the review portion of the video rather than in the description, because it just makes more sense. What though finally about the Ferrari? Well, the Ferrari California is the most different of the three cars. Of course, the Maserati and the Alfa Romeo are going to be similar, they share many parts, whereas the Ferrari is a totally different machine. The Ferrari has a significantly smaller engine, interestingly, than both of the other cars, at 4.3 litres to the 4.7 litre of both the Maserati and the Alfa Romeo. The Ferrari is also the most expensive of the three at nearly 240 grand, which is, it has to be said, a pretty hefty price given the fact that this isn't that much quicker than the other two, with a top speed of about 250 miles per hour instead of 240, and although it is, as you can see from the lap time, the quickest of the three, by a decent enough margin of around 2 seconds, it's still not exactly the kind of performance that you'd expect from a car that's almost 250,000 credits, plus the cost of tuning, of course. But overall, if you go for any of these three cars, as long as you don't expect it to be taking on Huayras, McLaren F1s, Nismos, etc., then you certainly won't be disappointed. These cars are very much so for people who like artistic vehicles rather than just fast cars. If you just want a fast car, then of course the Nissan GT-R, for instance, offers far more performance than any of these three for a much lower price. But that's not the point of these cars, it's about the whole experience. And for that, all three of these, in my opinion at least, are really desirable cars that don't let you down. What though about the shootout battle of points? Well, let's find out. Now, as we lay out the points of the three cars in comparison, you can start to see ways in which each particular car beats out the other two. Now, we already covered, of course, the fact that the Maserati does have superior power and torque to the Alfa Romeo, but the Alfa Romeo is lighter. We didn't cover as much of the Ferrari's differences. We mentioned the fact that it does have a smaller engine, but how do they actually compare, and which one, on paper at least, wins? Well, first of all, we have the price, and strangely enough, and kind of ironically, I would say, the Maserati is the cheapest of the three. But the really ironic thing is how much cheaper it is. Both the Alfa Romeo and the Ferrari are well over 200 grand, whereas the Maserati is well under it. That's an interesting point to bear in mind, especially when you consider that it does have the most power and torque of the three vehicles. Now, engine capacity on the Alfa Romeo and the Maserati are of course the same, so they both get a point there. As far as PP though, the Maserati is the highest, but for a very specific reason. Now, some people may not view this as fair, but I have counted it as such, and that is the Maserati can have a flat floor. And although the other cars cannot, and you could say, well, that's not fair to use it, which I can understand, but the fact that it can use it is not to be ignored, and if that advantage is available, you should use it. So, although it does of course reduce straight line speed for pure on-paper numbers, that is an advantage which is notable to the Maserati. So for PP, it does win out. If you discount that, then the Ferrari gets the point, but with it, it goes to the Maserati. We already mentioned as far as power that the Maserati wins, not by much over the Ferrari, but wins out nonetheless. Also, as far as torque, by a slightly bigger margin. Both of the other cars are below 500 pound-feet, whereas the Maserati is a fair bit over it. As far as weight though, as we already touched on earlier, the Alfa Romeo is lighter than the Maserati, but it's also lighter than the Ferrari, by a little bit less. And finally, the horsepower per tonne also goes to the Maserati, because although it's not the lightest of the three, in fact it's the heaviest, it has so much more power that it just makes up for that. All three have a very similar horsepower per tonne ratio. They're all very impressive in fully tuned form, but it is enough to give the Maserati the win. And although, as always, we do not count points to the lap time, because there are just too many variables involved, it is notable that once again, ironically enough, and it's actually getting so common now that it's not really ironic anymore, that the car with the least points of the three, the Ferrari California, is the fastest of the three around the track. Now that means that overall, coming in last, or third, is the Ferrari with a shocking 0 points, which is really strange for a Ferrari. Coming in second is the Alfa Romeo with a decent 2 points, but coming in at a clear and dominating first place is the Maserati with 6 points. Personally, I would have thought this battle would have been much closer between the three, especially given that the Alfa Romeo uses similar mechanicals to the Maserati GranTurismo, but that's not the case. The Maserati gets a clear victory, and when you factor in just how much cheaper it is, it really does make it a good deal, along with, of course, the fact that you have that flat floor option, which potentially makes it a much better choice of track car. Overall though, the Ferrari was the quickest around Monza and has the strongest top speed, which is also notable. And that's it overall for this particular Rivals matchup. So as always, if there are Rivals matches of 2 or more cars that you would like to see, be sure to slap those down in the comments below. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.